This is a reading from Genesis chapters 29 and 30. It's not all of it, of all of those chapters, but it's it's the important part. Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." Thank you. Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her, and Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" You have to wonder what was up with Jacob. Didn't he notice the difference? Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." So she named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son." Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune." So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "How happy I am. The women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. During wheat harvest, Reuben, this is later on. During the wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" "Very well," Rachel said, "he can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. You must sleep with me, she said. I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he slept with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband. So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him six sons. So she named him Zebulun. Sometime later, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Then, I like this part. Then God remembered Rachel. Oh, he listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. So when I read that story, a few crazy things pop into my mind. First, polygamy. They were polygamists. The second is that they were pretty active. And I wonder the people who want to ban certain books in school these days, but are okay with reading stories from the Bible, if they've ever read that as a Bible story at night to their kids. I doubt it. Just some crazy thoughts on my part, but it does pertain to what I want to talk about today. And if you're not familiar with Margaret Atwood's 1985 book, The Handmaid's Tale, or with the HBO series based on the book, you may be wondering about the title of today's sermon. So a little background is helpful. I already gave you a little bit of that background when I read that story just now. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to just say, the one thing that I also wonder about are the two servants. Think about them, Bilhah and Zilpah. How did that make them feel all that time, having babies, but they weren't allowed to keep them? Very odd, right? But that story, it's a story, the Handmaid's Tale rather, is a story that, that story is a story that to our modern sensibilities is almost unbelievable, right? The story of Jacob, wives who could not bear children telling their husband Jacob to sleep with their servant girls so that they, the wives, could have children. Well, technically Leah did have children, but eventually stopped. And Rachel was barren, right? Until she wasn't. Because, you know, God, a male figure, of course. Finally, he allowed her to bear two sons of her own, Jacob, and even though it's not in that story, later on she gave birth to Benjamin. All of this copulating is the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, in the version of that story that I read from the New International Version of the Bible, the word servant is used to describe Bilhah and Zilpah. But in the King James Version, the word used is handmaid. The same word is used in the King James Version for Mary, the mother of Jesus, when she's visited by the angel Gabriel, who tells her that God is going to impregnate her through the action of the Holy Spirit, and that the child will be the Messiah. And in response, Mary acquiesces and she humbly says, behold the handmaid of the Lord, be it done unto me according to thy word. Margaret Atwood's book, The Handmaid's Tale, is set in a dystopian nation called Gilead. It's a futuristic dystopian tale. Gilead was formerly known as the United States of America. And after a staged attack that killed the President of the United States and most of Congress, a radical political group called the Sons of Jacob uses a theonomic ideology to launch a revolution. The United States Constitution is suspended, newspapers are censored, and what was formerly the United States of America, the name is changed into Gilead and into a military dictatorship. The new regime, they move very quickly to consolidate power and to overtake all other religious groups, including traditional religious Christian denominations. In addition, They reorganized society using a very peculiar interpretation of some Old Testament ideas and their new militarized hierarchical model of how society should run and how religion should be held. And they create new social classes. One of the most significant changes is the limitation of people's rights. Women become the lowest ranking class and are not allowed to own money or property or read or write. More significantly, women are deprived of control over their own body and reproductive functions. Now, the story is told in the first person. It's narrated by a woman named Offred. Now, her real name is June. And she's called Offred, though, because she's one of the women who has now forcibly been made what they call a handmaid. And she is owned by a husband who is called a commander. He's one of the leaders of the country. He is a commander, and his wife, who is barren and can't bear children. And she is owned by them. She is the handmaid that lives in their house. And her name is changed to Offred because his name is Fred. So she is of Fred. She is his property. And all the women who are handmaids, their names are changed that way. And so in this era of environmental pollution and radiation that had occurred before, she is, June or Offred, is one of the few remaining women who's fertile and can bear children. So she's forcibly assigned to produce children for the commander and his wife. And she undergoes her training before she goes to live with Fred and his wife. She undergoes training to become a handmaid along with other women like her at a place called the Rachel and Leah Center. Isn't that interesting? And apart from other handmaids, other women from the handmaids, other women are classed socially, and they follow a strict dress code, ranked highest to lowest. The commander's wives all dress in teal blue. The handmaids are dressed in red with large white bonnets, so they can be easily identified. The aunts, who are the ones who train these girls to be the handmaids at the Rachel and Leah Center, they dress in brown. The Marthas, think about the names they're using here. Martha, if you know the story of Martha and Mary, the brother and the sisters of Lazarus. Martha was one who was always doing the work, right? Martha cooks and maids. Possibly they were women in the past who were sterile and could bear children, but they're past their childbearing years. They dress in green. And then there are the econo wives. These are the wives of the lower ranking men in society who are still under the control of their husband. The one thing that they also do is that women who oppose them, who try to run away, women who tried at the beginning to leave the country or whatever, they are, if they can't bear children or if they cause enough trouble, they are either sent to the colonies, which is somewhere in the middle of the United States now, which is divided because there's another nation on the other side of the United States. They are sent there where they're digging up uranium and dying from radiation poisoning and all that stuff. Or they are killed. They're hung if they cause enough trouble. And then there are the young girls who are around 14 or so. They dress in pink. And once they hit 14, they are often given to the commanders to be their wives. And I use that word theonomic above because there's a difference between a theocracy and a theonomy. A theocracy is a government controlled by a state-sponsored religion. In a theocracy, for example, a Christian theocracy, they may be, that may be the state-sponsored religion, but it doesn't mean that other religions can't exist. It does mean that they are restricted in their practices and subservient to the state-sponsored religion. And at any time, their rights can be taken away, and so could the rights of all their followers. That's how it is in a theocracy. In a theonomy, though, no other religions are permitted to exist. You either convert or you die. So Margaret Atwood drew from two sources for her novel. One is the first one is the story I read about Rachel and Leah and Jacob and their handmaids, right? The second is from her hearing and learning about a modern day Christian organization that relies on a male-dominated hierarchical structure, right? In that structure, every aspect of the members' lives are controlled by the men in charge. And in particular, women are subservient to men, especially to their husbands, who are called the heads of their wives, and women are called the handmaids. And that's a group that still exists. There are actually a few of those kinds of groups that exist around the world. And you may remember that when Amy Coney Barrett was being considered for her appointment to the Supreme Court, a lot was made of the church that she and her family belonged to, a church called People of Praise. And People of Praise is very much like this organization that Margaret Atwood drew her idea from. Men are in charge, women are called handmaids. However, women in that organization are permitted to hold jobs and are encouraged even to pursue higher education. And I have to make a correction there, or at least an addendum, since all of the publicity about that, they've stopped using that term handmaids in that church. But the record has to be set straight. Margaret Atwood herself said that she did not base her novel on People of Praise. In fact, she has never said on what organization she based it. There have been other similar groups that she probably knew about, and that's where she got the idea from. In fact, there is one group that exists right here in New Jersey, in southern New Jersey, called the People of Hope. And they do use the word handmaid. They still do. And they're very much like the People of Praise that Amy Coney Barrett and her family belong to. However, when we look at the way these organizations function and read Atwood's description of the theonomy that Gilead is, and then when we look at what is happening in America, it's hard not to be concerned, right? Especially when it looks like that fundamentalist right of the fundamental right of a woman to have autonomy over her own body, given in Roe v. Wade, is going to be overturned by an increasingly right-wing, white, male-dominated Supreme Court sometime, possibly next month. In his now infamous draft opinion that was somehow leaked, right? Justice Samuel Alito refers repeatedly to, quote, this nation's history and tradition as being at odds with abortion rights. And I confess it's hard for me to use that title, justice, for him and most of the members of SCOTUS these days. But as the author Becca Andrews writes, too often, when this nation's history and tradition is boiled down into such a broad generalization, it's the history and tradition of the white Christian men who have held power in the United States since its inception. But make no mistake, this country does not belong to them alone. And our history encompasses so much beyond their experiences and beyond the white supremacist ideals our nation was founded upon. Before this land, she says, was stolen by colonizers who called it America, it belonged to native peoples who had inhabited it for centuries. And as it turns out, people indigenous to America have a long, intimate history and tradition related to abortion and reproductive care. For one, they shared knowledge of which herbs can help a woman control her body. Stone seed and dogbane, which have natural contraceptive properties, were used by the Shoshone peoples, and the Potawatomi to prevent pregnancy. Studies of indigenous children of indigenous cultures rather, also turn up evidence of commonplace abortion practices. A South American matrilocal native tribe known as the Wichi reportedly abort the first pregnancy of any tribal member. It's a matter of routine to make the childbirths that follow easier. North American native tribes too have documented abortion practices that prioritize the health and well-being of the person carrying the fetus and their quality of life. Makes you wonder who's the civilized ones. And the fact that Mr. Alito and those who agree with him ignore the many historical records that are widely available that show that abortion was common and that methods for performing one were readily available to women and doctors even before the founding of the nation shows their ignorance. In fact, none other than the founding father, Benjamin Franklin, went out of his way to insert a recipe for inducing an abortion into the most widely used and enduringly read and the most reprinted math textbook of the colonial era. It's a math book, believe it or not. And he received so little pushback for the inclusion there that historians have barely noticed that it's there. Abortion was simply a part of life, as much as reading and writing and arithmetic. Franklin was an advocate of education for women, and he wrote in the book, when using his formula, one should have a knowledge of basic arithmetic and pay close attention to the measurements. I want to say that Ben Franklin wasn't the first person to include an abortion recipe in a textbook or in a math book. There were a few that occurred in England before the founding of the nation here, one that he actually drew from and improved upon, but abortion was common. Mr. Alito's draft argues that Roe must be overruled, pointing out that the Constitution makes no reference to abortion. There's a whole slew of things that the Constitution doesn't make reference to. Maybe so, but for the contemporaries who learned to count with Franklin's help, it was all about a matter of arithmetic, simple math. And I want to make clear that I respect the views of religious people who are opposed to abortion because they truly consider it to be murder or simply to be wrong or for other conscientious reasons. But the argument that abortion is killing a human being ignores the fact that not everyone agrees just when human life begins. A fetus as a person or a human being has never been a settled question within Christianity or within Judaism. There are large segments of both traditions that historically and currently see the embryo or fetus as potential human life, but not as fully human until birth or until some stage in the development of the fetus, well past conception. And that's the position that I hold to personally. Life for me begins when a baby takes its first breath. The Bible also it's virtually silent on the subject of abortion. There's one sketchy possibility that's mentioned in the book of Numbers, where we are told that there are circumstances under which Yahweh actually instructed his people to perform an abortion. If a man suspected his wife of having slept with another man and getting pregnant, he could take her to the priest, who would give her bitter water to drink and then perform a curse over her in order to induce a miscarriage. Now, what would happen is he would bring her there, and if the miscarriage occurred, that meant she had committed adultery. And the punishment for committing adultery was what? Stoning. So it was always all about the men, wasn't it? Whether or not this ritual ever accomplished its purpose, it doesn't say, but the only ingredients that are given in that part of the book of Numbers are water, dirt, and ink, and that curse, right? But the intent of the punishment was clear. For her alleged infidelity, the Bible says her pregnancy should be terminated. But the Jewish position really begins with Exodus 21, verse 22. It says this: when people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, meaning the woman doesn't die, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands. Not what the woman demands, what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. So only a fine, no punishment for homicide. On the basis of that passage, the rabbis argued in the Talmud that a fetus is not considered Adam, which is the word for human, and has no legal standing as a person. Killing a fetus is not murder, and it isn't treated that way in the Talmud. The mainstream Jewish position historically and today is that human life or personhood begins at birth when we take our first breath. There are a number of biblical passages that could be cited by rabbis over the years concerning that. You know, God formed man and breathed life into him. He wasn't a man, he wasn't human until he was breathing. And for most of the history of the Christian church, particularly the Catholic Church, especially the Catholic Church, the religious body who have for years been the most outspoken and vociferous in their opposition to abortion, for most of their history, one did not become a human being or a person until well after conception. St. Augustine, in the 4th century, he adopted the idea of Aristotle, the belief that the human soul didn't enter the fetus until 40 to 90 days after conception. And around the same time, St. Jerome emphasized human shape. He said the seed gradually takes shape in the uterus, and it, meaning abortion, does not count as killing until the individual elements have acquired their external appearance and their limbs. The church in the late 4th century allowed abortion if it was done both for the human before the human soul entered and before the fetus was of a human shape. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, he followed Augustine and not considering abortion of a non-ensouled fetus to be murder. Pope Innocent III, in the same century as Aquinas, emphasized that the soul enters the body at the time of quickening, meaning when the prospective mother first feels the baby move. When Pope Gregory the 14th affirmed the quickening test for ensoulment, and that was in 1591, he set the time as 116 days into pregnancy, or the 16th week. These were all Catholic popes. But the great reversal came when Pope Pius IX in 1869, he assumed ensoulment at conception. And by 1917, church canon law had been revised, dropping that distinction it had upheld between animated and inanimated fetuses. So Pius's position is the one that has been maintained by the Catholic Church ever since. And in the same way, criminal abortion statute generally didn't come into effect in the United States until the latter part of the 19th century. The common law had long been that abortion performed prior to quickening was not an indictable offense. Even abortion of a quickened fetus was generally not considered a criminal act under the common law, or at most, it was a misdemeanor. And in its 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, the Supreme Court used religious references to explain in part why the word person, as used in the US Constitution, does not include the unborn. It says, there has always been strong support for the view that human life does not begin until live birth. This was the belief of the Stoics. It appears to be the predominant attitude of the Jewish faith. It may be taken to represent a large segment of the Protestant community. That's in Roe v. Wade. Now, this doesn't mean that we should ignore or not be concerned about the potential life of the baby to be. We know that, right? That's why we advocate for prenatal care, right? For mothers to be given all the help they can when carrying a baby to term. I think the Supreme Court got it right in 1973 in terms of protection of potential life. During the first trimester, when abortion could occur with an IUD or the morning after pill or RU486 or minor surgical procedure, the decision to abort is entirely up to the woman. It should be. And in the second trimester, with quickening, human shaping, and maybe more complicated procedures, the state might be able to regulate medical procedures to protect the health of the mother. But it's important to know that, in fact, less than 10% of abortions now take place after the first trimester. So all this brouhaha over the past, 15, 20 years about late-term abortions and all that stuff is a bunch of hooey. By the third trimester, though, the potential life has become viable. And since the fetus could now live outside the womb, the state can protect that potential life by prohibiting abortion, except to preserve the life or the health of the mother. That's in Roe v. Wade. That's Roe v. Wade. But now it appears that what the extremist right-wing, white, male-dominated anti-choice movement has been working at for years, meaning the overturning of Roe, it's about to become a reality. And they are absolutely giddy over the prospect, so much so that there are already calls to make abortion a federal crime. Mitch McConnell says he will support that if that ever comes up, if the Republicans ever gain control again, and that comes up. States like Oklahoma, Texas, and others are already enacting draconian laws that have shuttered women's health care facilities like Planned Parenthood and places where safe abortions and contraceptives can be attained. And increasingly, women are being forced to try to go to other states where abortion is still legal. But for many women, that's not possible. They don't have the money, they don't have the means. They're being prevented perhaps by their parents or a husband or someone else. If you saw there, there's a brief advertisement. It's not a real advertisement per se, but it's a brief video about 3 minutes long that aired a few weeks ago on the internet. And it's a woman, an older woman in the car with her daughter who's a teenager, and they're driving down the road at night, and all of a sudden a police car pulls up behind them with the lights on. And the mother looks at the daughter and says, "Just be quiet, let me do the talking." And they roll down the window and the policeman shines the light in. He says, "Hello, ladies, good evening," all that stuff that they do. And she says, "Hello, officer." He says, "Where are you headed?" "Oh, we're going to visit relatives and so and so." He says, Are you planning on crossing the border?" And she says, No. And he shines the light on the girl and he says to her name, he mentions her name. He says, "Are you pregnant?" And there's silence, and they haul them out of the car and arrest them. Now that's only a commercial showing the possibility that exists in some of these states. States like Oklahoma and Texas have included penalties for anyone who assists in helping a woman to leave the state for an abortion, or they've even passed legislation that allows citizens to act as vigilantes and bounty hunters by reporting on women they know who've had an abortion, or to sue them. The governor of Oklahoma has proudly said that he wants those abortion laws in Oklahoma to be the strictest in the nation with no exceptions whatsoever. Just this past week, saying that human life begins at conception, that state legislature passed a bill that would make abortion legal except in a very few cases, and allows anyone to sue a clinic or a doctor or anyone involved for helping a woman to seek or obtain an abortion. And sadly, absurdly, That bill was introduced by a woman, the Republican Wendy Stearman. In his draft, Alito references adoption as the reason for abortion to be overturned, using the phrase, the domestic supply of infants, to indicate that less abortion would help increase the supply of babies that adoptive mothers are seeking, and that current safe haven laws and other programs allow women to safely give their children up with no repercussions. And Ms. Barrett argued that adoption still protects women from forced motherhood. And the choice, more focused, would be between, she says, say, the ability to get an abortion at 23 weeks, or the state requiring the woman to go 15, 16 weeks more, and then terminate parental rights at the conclusion, as though there's no feeling there for how that feels to a woman. It's bad enough that women are often feel guilty when they do have an abortion. And they live with trauma for years when they have an abortion, depending on their state of mind. Imagine forcing a young girl, 12 years old, who's been raped by her father or the victim of rape, forcing her to carry that baby to term and then having to give it up. This is the beginning of the nightmare scenario of Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale. And at the outset, we learned that because of, as I said before, that environmental degradation, particularly pollution around the world, an increasing number of women became infertile and many men were sterile. And so Gilead forces women who are able to bear children, to have children for those women that can't, and the commanders who can't. They're given no choice. There's no love in the act of procreation between a handmaid and a commander. In fact, the way it's done, in fact, in the King James version of the Bible, Rachel says to Jacob, here's my servant, she'll have a baby, basically she says, I'll hold her on my knees while you have sex with her so she can get pregnant. So that she feels sort of something, that Rachel feels something, right? And that's exactly how it occurs in The Handmaid's Tale. The woman lays down on the bed, in between the knees, the legs of the commander's wife. The commander copulates with her, and that's it. It's just a sham ritual based on that story from Genesis. And Ms. Barrett and Mr. Alito's comments are frighteningly close to suggesting such a thing, and the overturning of Roe pretends that kind of future for America. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, we don't have to go as far back anymore as Germany in 1939. Remember a few years ago when Trump was running and we all knew that what he would do, right? People were running around saying, oh, he won't win, but he did. And then we were warning about the radical agenda he wanted to institute and his policies. And they said, oh, that can't happen here. And it did. And it's still happening. I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm being realistic. And they won't stop with this attack on women. There's already talk among extremist groups about challenging laws that protect the LGBTQ community, to outlaw same-sex marriage, to make interracial marriage illegal again, to challenge and overturn laws that protect transgender youth. And given the steady march back to the 18th century that they're looking at, we have to wonder where they're going to stop. Given the rapid rise in authoritarianism and white supremacy in the country, we have to wonder if the repeal of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, is next. Or taking away women's rights to own property or have a bank account of their own. Is the 13th Amendment on their chopping block? The amendment that freed the slaves, that made slavery illegal? Oh no, Paul, it can't happen here. It's already happening here, and people are going to die. Women are going to die. Abortion providers are going to die. We know that as a fact because we've seen it in the past. Without sounding horrible, the wire hanger industry is gearing up. We are standing on a precipice. Actually, we're leaning over a precipice, and the ground is crumbling beneath our feet. We need to grab onto something to keep from falling over the edge. But what? Each other. I encourage you to do whatever you can to help protect the right to choose and the right of every woman to have autonomy over her own body and to make her own medical choices. There are organizations now, and I think what I'll do is I'll make a list of those and perhaps send them out as a blast for you, that you can donate to, that will help women who need to travel to other states. Planned Parenthood needs your support now more than ever. Contact your representatives and find out just where they stand on this issue and let them know that you will support them if they support a woman's right to choose, and will work to see that they are defeated if they don't. Send emails, write postcards, write to your local newspaper, march if you're able, whatever you can do. Our liberal religious tradition has always been supportive of a woman's right to choose. We've always fought for the rights of our Black sisters and brothers and people of color. We've long fought for the rights of our LGBTQ family members and friends. Our commitment to social justice, to environmental justice, to equity, to upholding the inherent worth and dignity of all people has always been what we hold on to. That's what we hold on to. And what will see us through the days and years ahead. As that song by Holly Near that's in our hymnal says, we are a gentle, angry people, and we will keep being gentle and angry in every instance of injustice and any attempt to deny the fundamental human rights that all people are entitled to. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.